Okay, welcome in everyone, and thank you for spending the next 45 minutes with us. My name's Jessica Chadwick. I'm the lead product manager over at Genea, and will be the host for today's webinar. And I really want to say up front what this session is and what it isn't. And this is not a product demo, right? We're not here to just walk you through a feature list. But what we are here to do is answer a question we hear constantly from customers, from security leaders, from IT leaders, which is what does it actually look like to migrate off of a legacy access control system? And is it really as hard as it feels from the outside, right? Most of the leaders that we talk to today, they aren't avoiding modernization because they don't see the benefits. They're avoiding it because the migration feels more like a gamble, right? So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on what the process is actually involving. So, what's hard, what's not hard, and where most assumptions turn out to be wrong. So, by the end of the session, you should walk away with a really clear mental model of what migration really looks like. And you can decide for yourself at the end whether the risk you're imagining matches the reality. So, I'm joined by two very awesome people today who see this from two very different angles. Mike is our senior vice president and is going to give us more of that architecture overview and the why behind how the process works. And Brandon here is one of our sales engineers and has been in the field for more of these migrations that we can even count. And he's going to help bring that ground level reality. And one quick note before we get going too, this is part one of a two-part series. So today we're building that foundation, but next month we'll actually have a customer on who's actually been through a migration and can give us a bit of a better experience on their experience in the field.
We're going to have a customer joining us who's gone through the process with us of the migrations. And again, as she was about to say, this is about demystifying the migration process for customers and partners. In fact, I was on a call this morning preparing for yet another Mercury-based system migration, and the questions arise about how the process works. So, Brandon, if you want, I can start off with how we go through the process, and then you can talk about what it actually takes to implement with the customer, because there's really two phases.
Yeah.
There's the prep phase and then the execution phase. So why don't I start with the prep side and then you get into the execution? Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So of course, Mercury-based system migrations or any access control system migration requires a lot of preparation. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you guys a little diagram that I think is helpful to understand exactly, what we're looking at with a system. So there is what I like to call this data pyramid that every access control system really revolves around. At the base layer of the pyramid is our system level of data, where you have, what are the actual sites in play? At every site, what are the controllers? What are the SIO panels? What are the readers? So it's really all your hardware level data. And of course, auxiliary inputs and outputs. So we're going to pull that layer first from your access control system, and then use that to frame up the new Genea system for you. So we'll go into the Genea platform, create a new customer account, and then load all the locations, create all the controllers, create all the SIO boards and the readers, and match all your naming conventions to what we find in your current system. And so how do we get this data? Right. First is usually just CSV exports. If your system has less than 1,000 doors, CSV is perfectly fine. Once we start getting, north of 1,000, then we try to do some SQL-based extraction to, do data extraction at scale. So we can do it either way, but we will take out that first layer and use that to carbon copy and create the framework of your Genea system. Then comes the next layer, which is your programming layer. This is your access rights, your schedules, card formats, and IO rules. So again, if it's like a Linnell or an open option system where we have server access, we will do SQL extraction, or we'll just pull CSV reports from the system. And then we usually take a pause there, and let me zoom out here and show you. This is right here, right? We're system mapping first, then we're extracting data, then we're migrating it into Genea. So once we've done the first two cuts of the site level or system level data and then the programming level data, then we start to go through in QA. So we'll say, do you need 500 access groups, right? Or is there a lot of stuff that's been left over here? Do you need 300 schedules, or can we clean up some of these? And usually the answer is yes. This is a great opportunity for a customer to get in there and say, yeah, this is what we actually want to carry forward. This is what we want to leave behind. So now we've taken these two slices out of your system, and the final layer comes together, which is the identity layer. So identity starts with usually a system of record integration. I'd say 9 out of 10 customers nowadays are integrating Genea into Entra ID, Okta, or Workday, right? Some source of truth for the user base. We'll pull that into the Genea system, and then we pull out from your current access control system the users, the card holders, et cetera, and then we map the two. And usually what comes out of that is a Delta file. And the Delta file, let's say if you have 10,000 card holders, the Delta file is usually about 5 to 10%, where there's an unknown quantity. We give that to you, the customer, and go through and say, hey, look, what do you want to do? Is this all contractors? Are these old temp badges, right? What is it you want us to do with this? And so the beauty of that is you now have an established system of record for user identities in the system, and that is self-managing, especially if it's like a SCIM-based integration like Okta, Entra ID. That's going to manage your identities on a go-forward basis as we're going through the rest of the migration process. So that's the data layer that we're pulling out, and we've set it all up in Genea. We've integrated your identity management system, your video management platform, and any other integrations. And then comes the brass tacks, which is the cutover process. So, Brandon, do you want to talk a little bit about how we do? Let's start with like a Mercury-based takeover. How would you take over an open options controller or a Linnell controller?
Yeah. So the first thing we're going to identify maybe a low impact area, right? Because you don't want to like sprint, or you want to almost crawl before you walk before you run. So we're going to identify that low impact area. We're going to go into that panel and set it to the parameters needed. For every other Mercury-based controller outside of Linnell, it literally is about a 9-step process. We've got a whole page about it. With Linnell, we do have to go in and change a little bit of that code. But again, all in all, you're looking, 15 to 20 minutes on the intelligent controller alone. And that's really where the strength is. We're not touching any of those downstream controllers. So it's very minimal impact. And then once we start that process, we work with the end users to identify those not necessarily critical areas, and we start with those typically. So from that perspective, it literally is having a guy on site, going to those intelligent controllers, changing a little some of the settings inside of the 1502, whatever that case may be, and then we get that download from our server, and we're off to the races.
Yeah. So, and I can show exactly what we're talking about here. So when you log into a Mercury controller, whether it's connected to, Linnell, Avigilon, Genetec, it doesn't matter. The Mercury controller firmware is common across all of the Mercury OEMs. So when you log in, you'll see this controller management GUI. So you're literally pinging the controller's IP address. You log into it, and then you say, all right, we're going to change the hostcom settings. So if you remember back to what I was just going through, we pulled out all the layer cake of data. So we know every controller in your system, the MAC addresses, etc., the IP addresses that they have on the network. So the last remaining piece to take it from, let's say, Linnell to Genea is you log into the controller's GUI, and then you just switch the hostcom settings from, because right now it's set usually with Linnell to IP server, and then it has an IP address for the server, like the comm server on Linnell that it's talking to. So all we're going to do is just change the host comm settings to IP client, and then give it the Genea cloud IP address or host URL, depending on the customer's DNS settings. But it's this simple, right? You just plug in mercury-api.secure.io over port 3001, and it will call out to the cloud, and it comes online in Genea. So that's literally the process for how you take one controller from one Mercury OEM PAX system to another. Yeah, very, very straightforward process. Of course, the trick is getting all that data up front and making sure that we have all the MAC addresses, so that once we see that MAC address call out to our cloud, then we know, okay, that's a Acme Corporation controller, and it goes to the San Francisco or the Atlanta office. So that's literally what's happening now. It's very, very straightforward process.
Yeah, and it seems very easy too, and thank you for the technical overview, to start us off. I'd like to almost unpack that a little bit more though too, before we even get to looking at, what that implementation looks like from a technical level. I'm curious, Brandon, uh, before we even get there, decide that we wanna do a migration, right? What are really the most common fears that you hear when organizations think about migrating off of their current system?
Yeah, it usually boils down to one question, and the question depends on where they are. Maybe a catastrophic incident's happened. Is how much, right? How much time, how much pain, and how much money,
Mhm.
right? So it all depends on where in their journey are, of which answer they're seeking, right? So usually it's like, what is the impact for me and my business, especially when you're looking at a security perspective? How long are we going to be down? What kind of friction can my employees expect? How many other systems are going to be affected by this outage, right? And so that's really the strength of our implementations team, or implementing a great uh, plan, is to have those and mitigate those issues up front, which is what Mike was alluding to earlier. Is we set forth all these benchmarks and timelines for you, and agreed upon, and we go from there, and we develop a plan that it's not just like, okay, day one, let's rip off the band-aid and go. It literally is a step-by-step, paint by the numbers process that we've
Yeah.
implemented here.
Well, and to put a finer point, I'll give you some customer examples. So we did a project with a company called DXC in Poland, in their Warsaw office. It was on. I feel like I'm picking on Linnell. I mean, I'm not sad about it, but I am a little bit. So they had an office running on Linnell in Warsaw, and they had green EP panels there, and they wanted to see what it would look like to do the migration. And
So,
we
oh,
just did
there he
exactly
is.
what we said. We pulled out all the data from the system, set up the site in Genea, had the MAC addresses logged into the controllers. And I think what they were really surprised by is that there was no perceptible downtime at the door, because we're just, again, changing the hostcom settings. All the same credentials, all the same access rights are already on that controller, and the controller is the one making the decision to open or close the door. So we're just changing, ultimately where it's reporting back to after it's made the decision, and where it gets new updates from. So if you're doing a Mercury-based system migration, there's no door downtime. If you're doing a physical rip and replace, let's say you're coming from AMAG or Brevo or some proprietary access control system where you do have to replace the controllers, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So, we usually see two separate strategies there. One is, especially if downtime is a high consideration, what you need to do is then install the new controller either right next to it on the wall or even in the same cabinet, and then take the wires and move them, to the new controller one door at a time. So usually you'll bring a door down for, let's say 10 minutes on average. And I see customers, they'll put a security guard there. Some, they're like, I'll just have the IT guy go stand there while we're doing this. It just depends on who you are as a customer. But that's the process, right? You have your existing AMAC controller, you put the new Mercury one right next to it, and then you just start pulling the wires off the AMAG one, putting it onto the, to the Mercury controller. and go door by door. So it's definitely much more meticulous, technician involved process at that level if you're doing a proprietary system migration. But downtime is very minimal on a per door basis. The worst that you can do is like have to rip the whole cabinet off the wall at the same time. Now you got like 8 doors offline. That's what I don't recommend doing.
Yeah, definitely. So what I'm hearing really is that the hesitation, right, isn't completely irrational at all. And there are real seeming risks that come into play, like if I stop paying, does my system stop working? Or do we have to rip and replace everything out and start over, right? So yeah, there's a definitely a reasonable space to understand what the risks are. But
Yeah, I
maybe
mean, if
let's
it's a Mercury migration, I would say the fear is not irrational, but is definitely overwrought. Mercury migrations are very simple. It's really the proprietary ones where door downtime becomes a consideration that you have to factor in.
Gotcha. Okay. So maybe let's flip the question too, because I think the conversation usually focuses on the cost of moving and skips the cost of staying. So, Brandon, can you think of a situation where maybe a customer waited longer than they probably should have? And what was driving that, and what did it end up costing them?
Yeah, a recent one that we had, they were on a proprietary system and they just kept pushing it off because of cost and fear of the moving, right? The devil you know, right? And so they stuck it out and then their server died. And this was an old system that wasn't even being supported by the current manufacturer. And because of the vertical they're in, they sustained massive fines, right? And it became one of these like, okay, we'll do this over 6 months. Okay, now we need to do it within 6 weeks. So because they kept pushing off that pain point, it got to the point where now they were forced to, right? So at some point in time, you're gonna have to rip off that band-aid. And if it's a proactive approach instead of a reactive approach, we get that time to where we can understand and implement this in a timely manner to where it's not a forced upon everybody, because at that point when it's forced, everything goes into chaos, right? The training to get everybody up to speed, the install piece, because now you're trying to avoid the fines, especially in this specific vertical. So, I mean, and the fines weren't cheap. So all that, like him and Han, like, oh, we need to save money. We can't afford this now. When they went down for that extended period of time over 3 days, that cost was well above anything that would have been for them to do the cutover 6 months earlier when their server was still in decent shape, when they were still kind of getting support. So it's really, where are they in that journey of changing over, right? They knew the system was out of date. They knew that the manufacturer wasn't supporting it, but it became a financial burden, right? But then the unexpected happened, a catastrophic event, and then they were just kind of really rushing at that point. And so because we have this implementation process that we've kind of got down to a science, we were able to get them back on the rails. But it's still, when you look at it from
Yeah.
that lens of like, man, we thought we were doing right, and then now it's just everybody all hands on deck.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a great example to, really kind of explaining a real life use case of what somebody's gone through. And, in the beginning, over that brief technical overview, a lot of the concerns or just use cases, Brandon, that you spoke about come from really not knowing what the process looks like under the hood. So, Mike, at a high level, from what you showed earlier, right? Let's break it down a little bit more. How should people actually be thinking about a migration, and really how do we approach it, either in phases, steps? What are your thoughts?
Mhm. Yeah, so we kind of touched on it a little bit when your power went out, but
Yeah.
but I'll kind of zoom out just a one step there, because I talked a lot about like, okay, how do we get the data from the current access control system to prepare for the migration? But what oftentimes gets missed is the integrations around the system that we have to prepare for. So we'll do the carbon copying process and either simultaneously or subsequently then set up the third party integration. So if you have like a Splunk integration that you're workplace services or your executive team relies on to understand attendance on a day-to-day basis. We got to get that set up before we do cutovers, right? Because the data feed from your current system is going to stop, or you're going to have, let's say you have 10 sites and you do one site migration per day. Well, during that transitionary period, we need to make sure that your data lake is receiving the data from the sites that are on your current system and the sites that are on Genea. So those types of considerations are the ones that are sometimes people don't think about when they're first engaging with a partner, but that's where our team comes in and really pulls that out from the customer. Like, we try to turn over every stone because we know if we don't, there's a really angry email or phone call coming down the line and we don't want to do that. So, I'll give you an example. So we did an open options takeover for all of Lifetime Fitness, right? They were all their 260 or 80 clubs, across the country were on open options, and we were able to do the entire 280 club migration in two days. Like, huge shout out to our partners at Affinitech. That was a fantastic job. But it shows the ease of the migration part. But there was 3 months of lead up to those 2 days. We had to build some custom PowerShell scripts for their Active Directory instance to get all the metadata for employees and all their members into the system, because they use all that data to track by club attendance and all this other data. So that piece of the puzzle is often overlooked, but for us is super important because we don't get it right. Those are very unpleasant phone calls we don't want to be a part of.
Yeah, I can imagine, right? And so, yeah, it sounds like there are lots of different segments that we consider, and it definitely varies depending on the ask from customers, right? And that's for any implementation. So, so how much of this, we do a lot of that upfront work to understand what customers need essentially to be implemented. How much of that is gated or even led by the customer as far as a timeline or sequence goes?
I mean, I would say it's almost always led by the customer, right? The customer they know their sites, they know their people, and so they know the speed at which they want to move. So your customer had 100 and I want to say 86 sites on their Linnell system when we were doing the migration. And that was very much a crawl, walk, run. So the crawling portion was they had vacated a building in downtown Minneapolis that was part of their corporate campus there. And they were like, we're just going to give up this building. So they actually had us migrate that one first from Linnell to Genea because they still had the lease for another year and a half. So it was the perfect case, or you could not mess that up, right? So they said, here you go, just show us what you can do. And when we did the cutover in 2 hours, they're like, okay, all right, now let's start with a building that has people in it. And so that was the walk part. And then when we started running, that was a fun 6 weeks, but we did, we were doing 6 sites a day for about 6-7 weeks there. But that's the crawl walk one. And the customer, they had their whole, commercial real estate and physical security team collaborate on the biggest smart sheet I've ever seen, with every site and every door and every controller on that smart sheet. And we had, you would wake up when we would start doing the installs at 5 a.m. and there was no questions about which controller you were cutting over when. It was perfectly sequenced. So, and that actually became a lot of the operating model that we adopted on a go forward basis because it was so well planned but that was customer driven, right? They were like, we were not taking any risks here. So we really appreciate it when the customers participate in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. The risk part too makes a lot of sense, right? And it helps kind of alleviate some of the things that Brandon brought up earlier about if I stop paying, does my system stop working? Or, would our team be tied up for weeks? Some of that, to a degree, seems to be controlled in this migration process, right? Because you don't have to fully commit 100% all of your systems, all of your buildings at once. We can take somewhat of a phased approach and lean on the customer, right?
Yeah, I mean, typically you're gonna have at least one or two internal champions from the customer that are highly engaged on, if weekly calls for at least a couple months. It just really depends on the level of complexity we're talking about here. If you've
For
got
sure.
10 sites and you're running it on a Vigilon, we can usually knock that out in like 2 or 3 weeks. If we're talking thousands of doors, hundreds of sites, tens of thousands of cardholders, the entire diligence process is going to take 2 or 3 months before you start cutting over sites, right? We really, really want to make sure we're measuring 3 times before we're cutting the first time.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And so, what is I guess step one really look like, or maybe talk to me about either one of you, what's happening before the integrator even shows up? Because that's, I think this is a big part that most people don't realize.
Yeah, so Mike alluded to it earlier. We're getting all the reports, right? In CSV file, flat file, copies of everything that we need to do to do a transfer for. So that way we can stand the system up in parallel to their existing, right? That mitigates that downtime. Again, we've got an entire data sheet of how to do this, but really gathering that information because, um, a goal without a plan is just a wish, right? So we really hone in on all of this planning because at the end of the day, that's what makes this successful. It's not just like, oh yeah, we've done this 40 times. Yeah, we have, but we also have a script that we follow and then we add on to it, right? We take the feedback from our customers. As Mike said earlier, a lot of that is driven from them, right? Their pain points and things that they've been experiencing the last umpteen years with their current system. So between the feedback from the end user plus our experience in doing this, that really has streamlined this process. So even from first meeting, just gathering that information. The more information we can get, the better. And as Mike said, even if it's data that we need to delete later, right? Clean data in, clean data out. It's still good that we get that up front so we can start building that portal up.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes right back to walk before we can run, right? That's great. And we mentioned Mercury quite a few times too, but what does this look like if someone's on Honeywell Pro Watch or maybe even Vanderbilt?
Yeah, so it's going to vary on the Pro Watch, right? We can, depending on the model, if you will, the firmware as well. We can take those directly over. On the Vanderbilt side, we would replace that intelligent controller with a Mercury-based intelligent controller, 1502 or 4502. But again, we're looking at minimal hardware replacement because we can reutilize those Wiegand or OSDP readers and all the downstream boards as well. So even when we're talking about anything outside of a Mercury hardware, right? A Mercury based firmware, we can still take those over. So, still same process as before. It's just the hardware kind of changes, but the process in the background stays the same.
Yep.
That definitely makes sense too. So, Brandon, what's a question then you wish customers asked you earlier in this conversation, or something that would save them weeks if they knew to ask?
um, what else do you need, right? Because sometimes they're like, nope, this is everything. And so it's just probing them for more information. But that's really about like, what else can I give you, right? Because it helps us if they're, I wouldn't say willing to give us the keys of the city, but open to, you know, what we need instead of like, oh, this is all we can give you. That helps streamline that process as well. Um, because at the end of the day, we're trying to save them time and get them to a place that they're trying to be. So yeah, just don't be shy about asking, right? That's it. We're here to help.
Yeah, for sure. And, the whole open integration piece is really important too. Like Brandon was saying, if you have more things, it's always worth the ask before you migrate on how that can be incorporated too, right? So I'm wondering as well, maybe we should describe what does a more open system actually unlock for teams day to day, or that they don't have today.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I'm in Portland is I'm here for one of our integrator partners. They have a tech summit twice a year. And last year I was here, we didn't have any customers. And then now half the room has converted to Genea. So it's good to see the conversations that were started a year ago started, now they've become reality. And uh, one of them is like a fairly large credit union. They had like 60 or so locations. And they started rolling out ServiceNow to automate like access requests. And on their old system, there was no API that they had access to, and they already integrated Genea ServiceNow. And they were just telling me about it. They weren't asking me like, hey, where do I find the API and how can I get this to work? They just used our API and built the ServiceNow integration. They're just telling us that they did it, which is kind of dreamland, I would say, for me as as head of product. I love when customers do that, but not having to pay, they didn't have to go and like fight with the integrator to get a license for an API key, and wait 6 weeks to do that. They just can log into the system and use our API key. We have other customers that use our webhooks to do, observability. Um, I was talking to another prospect here. They're not a customer yet, but they're very curious about how they can use webhooks to get automated alerts for if a reader goes offline or if a controller goes offline. I'm like, well, yeah, not only can you use webhooks, but have you thought about just getting a Teams message? And they were like, no. So the net effect is it really opens people's minds to, possibilities that they hadn't considered or had written off as not possible. Like, oh, my system would never support that. There's no integration for that. There's no this, that, or the other. And when you get to an open environment with an open REST API, webhooks, Kafka topics, like the possibilities of what you can do in an automated fashion really, really start to plant those seeds of the possible for the customer.
Yeah, I think it changes that power dynamic, right? We're giving power back to those end users, right? They can now make their own decisions and they're not reliant on us to tell them what their system can do. Um,
Yeah.
we're giving them the ability to do what they want it to do with, like Mike said, the APIs and the webhooks. And then all of our integrations, right? You don't need to call us up for a license. It's literally there in your integrations page. So it's really returning that power back to that end user. I'm sure anybody in our chat can attest, like, when you want to make a change to your enterprise level system, you better be up to date, you better be trained, and you better be ready to open up that pocketbook. So I
For
think
sure.
with the openness that we do, I think that's a breath of fresh air that has been long needed in our industry.
Yeah, no kidding, right? I mean, the open systems are really helpful in all of those ways you described too. But as you know, I'd like to flip the question. So, and we hear this a lot about, in our industry, but the argument that Mercury isn't truly open because the source code isn't public. How do you actually think about that?
I mean, look, there's the in this in especially in the access control portion of the physical security industry, Mercury is is it the a 100% most quote unquote open? No, because of that dynamic, right? You do have to be an approved Mercury SDK partner to have SDK access to write to the boards. So there are other controller, products out there on the market that do allow anybody to have access to that SDK. But what is the actual benefit of a quote unquote open or let's say interoperable system, right? The benefit to the customer is that I have a menu of other competitors to Genea that I can choose from. So if we screw up, Jess, like if you and I don't make a good product, the customer can take that, and there's literally 28 other Mercury OEMs that they can go choose from to work on the same hardware. Whereas if you go get like an Azure board, there's only two options, right? Even though, yes, like they have an open SDK you can go get from them, but there's not an ecosystem that's built around it. And so if the core like optionality or the core benefit that customers are looking for is optionality, there's no more optionality out there that what Mercury offers. So it's not perfect. Like everybody wants them to publish their SDK on the internet. It's probably not going to happen, but the customer does get the optionality that they're looking for versus, yeah, sure, there are other open options, but there's no vendors that are built on those hardware platforms. So it's really limited.
And there's no controls, right, Mike? I mean, when you have your open SDK, anybody then can then say, yep, I'm an access control company, but how secure are they, right? What kind of Q&A are they doing? So Mercury is kind of at least ensuring that customer, whoever they can buy with confidence that, yep, if you've chosen Mercury, like we vetted these software manufacturers, they check all these boxes, they meet this certain criteria, and it gives them that, the warm and fuzzies that it's not just a trunk slammer that's going to leave them high and dry in a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to be said for that. Like the amount of Mercury EP boards that are 20 plus years old that we've taken over, there's something to be said for hardware that lasts 20 plus years. When you're talking about a return on your investment, getting 20 years of life out of, think about if you had to run a laptop for more, like every we all buy laptops, they only last for like 4 years at best, right? And by the end you're like, this thing doesn't work anymore. With the Mercury controller, it's actually it's bulletproof, it's rock solid. I mean, they actually wish it was less reliant because they get more, recurring sales on those things. But there's definitely something to be said. But yes, there are certain people in the industry that quibble with the fact that it's like you can't just go download the Mercury SDK. I think that ignores the core benefit that customers are looking for, which is optionality.
Yep, completely agree as well. The more options, the better in most cases, we'll say, right? So, yeah, I think we had a really good overview on, the architecture and what's possible. But the question I'd still be asking if I was in the audience is, what is this actually going to feel like for my team? Because process on paper and experience in reality aren't always the same thing, right? So, Brandon, have you had customers maybe who've told you that after they switched, something got easier that they didn't even know was hard before?
Yeah, the one thing that I constantly hear is time, right? We're giving them time back on a number of different things, and most of it's death by a thousand cuts, right? They didn't realize that the thing that they spent 10 minutes on, but they did it 7 times a day, right? That's over an hour. Those are the things that we're giving back. The card management, right? Especially when they move to the mobile credentials, that's almost instantaneous. So no more, oh, I lost my card, deactivate. All that stuff can be done instantaneously. So the biggest thing that the one thing I hear over and over is time that we've given back. So, and it's on various things, but the mobile credentials is the one that sticks out the most for me.
I mean, that's the one that sticks out the most for me too. But I won't repeat the point. I think what the other one I hear all the time from customers is that the the amount of fear that they have to manage and the amount of time that they sink into version control that goes away, right? So if you have, let's say you have an access control system and you have different instances of that system, some are running on, let's say, the software version 8.1, and then the other ones were running on 8.3, and the other ones were running on 7.5. Version control, especially across multiple instances, is a huge nightmare for customers. They have to do planned downtime to update the versions, and that whole time investment, the planning that goes around that, their team is freed up to work on other more important things than updating the software version, or God's sakes, the SQL licensing, on their instances or their servers. So, it I think people don't oftentimes recognize just how much like mental bandwidth goes into managing and worrying about infrastructure until they don't have to do it anymore.
I concur. Yeah, the days of manually having to add everything in, is definitely over. And in the world of AI, there's so much innovation, even just open to be created. Speaking of open too. So, um, I'm curious as well, since we're on the topic of AI, how do we envision that maybe in the future AI can lean into this migration process as well?
I definitely can't say who this customer is, but I can tell you that we are working with a customer right now on a Linnell migration that is using Claude Code to script the uh, the hardware programming process for every site. Because when we started talking to them, they're like, "Well, we'll pull the CSV files from Linnell, and they only have about 500 doors, so it's not like a huge system." Um, but he's like, "Wait, I could just use your API in Claude Code and do it myself, right?" And like, yeah, here you go. So that was one of the cooler moments in the last month, I would say, that's happened with AI. Completely outside of the Genea system. It's not a feature like necessarily within Genea. Like, just use our API and Claude Code, and you can, you know, both manage the migration, but also on a go forward basis, when they add new doors, he can just write a slash command in Claude Code that adds the new door to the system, with all the same like specifications about strike timers, end of line resistance, all of those values that they were setting by hand. He's now just written as a slash command in Claude Code. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's definitely very cool. Yeah, I know the power of AI not only speeds things up to some degrees, but can definitely make things better and create things in a way that maybe we didn't envision for ourselves. So, love to hear that and can't wait to see, what comes up with AI over the next year and beyond too.
Yeah.
So, we are almost at our time to do some Q&A. Before we do that, feel free to go ahead and add your questions into the chat that you have, and we'll do our best to get through them all. But before we do start that too, maybe let's hear one more thing from either Mike or Brandon, just on what was a moment maybe where there was an aha moment for you or for your customer that just really made sense to migrate in the way that we're covering today?
Um, like an aha moment. I think the aha I had one where we just started getting the first purchase orders from this customer to start the migration process, so it's very fresh for them and us. They have about 1,200 doors on, again, Linnell. It seems to be a theme. But what they had held off on the migration of their Linnell version so long and deferred so many SSAs that the bill to bring their SSAs current and get upgraded to 8.4, I think was the version they were trying to get to on Linnell, was more than 8 years of licensing on Genea. So it cut, like, they're like, well, aha. Well, now instead of having to pay for this SSA, expense to Linnell, I can use all of that money to migrate to Genea and get 5 years of licensing taken care of. So I think oftentimes people think, oh, well, there's no recurring licensing costs, on Linnell, but that is not true at all, right? The annual SSA is a recurring software cost, no different than paying for a door license on Genea. It's just a matter of, the words that they wrap around it, but the net effect is the same. So, yeah, that was a big aha moment, and I love to hear, because we've been saying that talk track forever. Like, look, guys, it's not more expensive than Linnell. Like, it's almost the exact same, but people oftentimes don't think of it that way.
Absolutely. Yep. Cost now versus cost over time is definitely something to consider too. All right, guys, you ready for some questions from the group?
Yeah.
Looks like we have a couple here. One, maybe we'll throw it at Brandon. We have 12 locations. Can we phase migration across sites over time, or do we have to do them in lockstep?
No, that's the power of our system. We can stand both systems up in parallel. Depending on how we do the implementation of provisioning, as you add them into one system, if we've tied it into Active Directory, that will also be pushed into Genea. And if we've set up our user groups correctly, yeah, you can slow roll this to, what meets your day-to-day facilities needs.
Awesome. Yeah, great answer. Okay, we have another question. Are there any specific gotchas or helpful tips that you've learned from your higher education customers about how migrations go in a highly residential higher ed environment?
Yeah, I mean, look, we started doing universities in earnest last year, and we learned a lot, frankly, right? We Our pedigree is in, enterprise office, not in universities. So we had to make, we over a 6-month period, we had to build a lot of features that helped specifically in resi halls, because what you get with residential halls is you have to have basically one access right per door, and in a residential hall you can have 500, 600 to 1,000 plus doors, so you got 1,000 plus access groups, and managing dynamic access group assignment in real time at that scale and complexity was a challenge, right? So we had to build new capabilities inside of Genea to make that possible. So that was just one lesson we learned on entering like the university space, and especially like higher ed residential. Um, Gotchas though, for customers, I think wireless lock management and like understanding like what type of gateways you have, what type of locks you're running. Sometimes customers just go like, I have wireless locks, and they don't really know like, is it a Legion? If it's a Legion, is it Engage series? Is it 8400s? Is it 8300s? Like, we just, people don't oftentimes know enough about their wireless lock install base to guide, like, to help us, and we end up spending a ton of time, with the integrator, understanding what that looks like, so we can make sure, we've got all of our ducks in a row before the migration. So that's a big one. I've got five. I've got like 2 minutes left before I gotta jump off. So let me answer Eric's question, and then I'll let you guys finish up with the Q&A, and I'll get out of here. So through your open API, Eric has asked, through your open APIs, can you integrate birthrights from SailPoint into individual user profiles for security groups? Yes, absolutely. That's one of the benefits of our open SCIM API. So you can connect your SailPoint instance to do access right provisioning, metadata syncing. So you need to know department, employee number, who their manager is, like emergency contact information. All that's coming in through our APIs. So yeah, great question, Eric. Looking forward to talking to you more about that next week when I see you in person. So with that, Jess, Brandon, you guys can close it out from here. Thank you so much for having me, and
Thanks, Mike.
talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you joining. All right. We do have one or two more questions as well before we conclude. Brandon, so the question is, what can we do to speed up the initial process of implementation? What can we prepare ahead of time before we get started?
Just the clean data. That's the data piece, and having a good plan, right? I know we talked about this earlier, and we're probably beating a dead horse at this point in time, but that whole implementation process, our largest cutover, which we alluded to earlier, was 5 months long. 3 months of that was planning. So really just having a firm plan up front and knowing what you want, right? Have that wish list out. So as Mike said earlier, if the more we know up front, the more we won't have to address in the back end. So have that wish list ready, and have access to your data. That's probably the thing that slows us down. We'll get ready for day one, and then, oh well, we don't know who has access to that. So it's really having those IT stakeholders availability, and getting the data. Those are probably the two things that slow us down the most at the beginning.
Yep, that makes sense as well. And of course, we can also lean in too if that data needs a bit of help organizing as well, right? So
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits, right? Is that sometimes they didn't realize that those departments were still in their system. They would just keep on going. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So this gives them an opportunity to clean that data up.
absolutely. Okay. And the last question was around what the realistic timeline from a first conversion to fully live looks like for maybe a more mid-sized customer. But I think you partially answered that before. Getting that data clean up front will help save months of time on its own. But what else? What other time frames, or what's really the expectation?
So it's kind of a loaded question and a lot of variables at play here. Because if they are going to upgrade, let's say, power supplies and things like that, the supply chain variables that we need to take into consideration. But let's say it's just a straight hardware takeover and all we're doing is moving Mercury from one system to the next. Um, it's something we've got to work with their channel as well, their integrator. But let's say a few hundred doors, a couple months. Again, that's kind of what's outlined in that initial implementation is like, hey, these are what we need, right? Because even though we might be able to execute that fine on the back end because it's mostly done through software and all that good stuff, the boots on the ground, the integrator as well. So 2 months, it could be soon, it could be less, it could be more. It all really depends on a lot of those different variables that we have to kind of take in consideration at the beginning.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandon. All right, that will conclude our
Oh,
Q&A portion.
we've got one that says, "Who is the largest university customer as it relates to electronic doors?"
Good catch.
The one that's actually fully deployed and continually grow is Mercer University in Georgia. If you need a contact, let us know. We can put you in contact with them. We've got various ones that are in various stages of deployment as we speak, but the one that has the most active doors right now is going to be Mercer in Georgia.
Not too far from me.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, y'all. Well, a quick recap before we wrap. So, remember, today was the playbook, what migration actually involves, why the fears tend to be bigger than the reality as well, and what that hands on experience looks like when it's done right. So, next month, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to have a customer join us who's actually been through this. So, someone who can tell you what they've expected going in, what surprised them, and what they'd tell maybe a peer who's still on the fence. So more details on that session coming soon. So make sure you keep an eye out in your inbox. Otherwise, Brandon, thank you so much for your help. And to everyone that joined us today, thank you for the time, and we will see you next month.
Thanks, everybody. See y'all.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
See you later.